think you did a fantastic job because the bill is actually quite short, and it's basically as simple as it can be. So I'd like you to all appreciate what Jim has done for the United States and for the world by giving him a very warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. That's a tough act to follow. When I saw I was going to be after Greg, I was like, oh man, what did I do to deserve this? He's very organized and has a very polished presentation. I'm not that accustomed to public speaking myself. My role in my job was very much behind the scenes, and occasionally would speak in committee sessions if a member had a question. Yes, if a member had a question, I would attempt to answer it. However, I generally avoided that because the questions were usually not designed to elicit, objective information. It was to support a position, and as a nonpartisan counsel, it was not a comfortable role for me to be in. So I have not spoken publicly very much. My topic was given to me, and it's a very good one. The politics, and I think where I am now. I mean, I've been out of the legislative cycle for 4 or 5 years, and I've been reading a lot and talking to a lot of people and studying where we are in a larger way than just the monetary policy, because I think monetary reform is the key to a lot of the other policy changes, and I'm really convinced that there's a lot of change that's already happening. We look at the power elites as having something that we don't, and in a way they do, and they've taken advantage all along. I mean, there's an evolution that's been very powerful that's occurred throughout our history. And it's fairly recent. I mean, the 20th century was, Peter Drucker talks about that as having been the most radical social transformation in history. I don't know how far in history, and it completely upended the order. It did so relatively peacefully. We had things of oppressed people seeking change. It was the two largest groups in the U.S. at the outset in 1900. The two largest groups among the people were farmers and domestic live-in servants. By the end of the century, domestic servants were relatively non-existent, and the farmers had been completely supplanted. I mean, I think that's an extraordinary set of circumstances that allowed the economic order to evolve so rapidly. I mean, the industrial workers were non-existent in 1900. Up until then, even what was considered to be the Industrial Revolution were primarily craft workers. Car manufacturers up until like 1908 were small shops with specialized people turning out small numbers of cars. Mass production came in 1908 and completely upended everything, and yet those workers coming into existence were what allowed the farmers and the domestic servants to be absorbed into an economy and experience a way of living that was vastly better, even if it was poor, than they had experienced before in their prior existence. The transportation allowed the cities to grow to support this. Before the railroad, the cities were limited by how much food could be hauled in one day, which is essentially 50 miles, which is why New Jersey is the Garden State, because it supported both New York City, Trenton, and Philadelphia with small farms. And that's what fed the cities. Railroads completely changed that and allowed the concentration of industrial workers to happen. This is extraordinary change that affected banking and affected the way that corporations were viewed. And I like to look at that. One of the things that I've listened to, again, this guy's been dead for 40 years, I think, Alan Watts, who was a great English thinker and philosopher who came to the United States and popularized Zen and lived on the West Coast, associated with Allen Ginsberg and some of the other beat writers. He made a statement in something I was listening to that said that if you have to sign it, if you have to put a seal on it, if it has to be witnessed, if you have to take an oath about it, it's not real. That we do all of those things to create a way of perceiving something as being effective, and it's not. And I was like immediately struck by that because, you know, I spent my legal career working for 30 years of it for the House of Representatives drafting legislation, and it was something that I had come to appreciate over all that time. I dropped out of college in the late 60s and worked construction, was a labor foreman for 4 or 5 years, and wound up being an electrician for a year or two before I slipped back into the education role. And it was always an amazement to me to see two-dimensional prints on a flat board in the construction office and watch it materialize into a three-dimensional actual thing out there that you could go up and touch and climb, and there's a building there. Then I went to the Congress, and you know, I spent my day typing words onto a little screen that are pixels and send it off somewhere. I mean, there were obviously some huge changes during that process too, because we didn't even have fax machines or internet when I started. So everything had to be printed and left out front, and the delivery people, the couriers and the pages and everybody were everywhere and delivered everything. And you know, then we got the fax machine, and wow, that's amazing. The first time I was working on the 1987 bailout bill, the original, not the 89, not the big one, but the 87. And the fellow from the Senate Banking Committee picked up my latest draft around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I went home, and he was going to I gave him 3 copies, one for him, one he was going to drop off at Treasury, and I don't know what he was going to do with the third, but you know, we gave him 3. When I came back the next morning, there was this thing called a fax that was delivered to me, and it was from a law firm in LA, and it had all marked up the stuff that I delivered at 1 a.m. And I'm like, okay, that my world has just changed in a big way. And it's just a little example. I mean, fax machines disappeared within 10 years, right? We didn't use them after that. Everything, all the bills that we created went into PDFs, and we emailed them to the world, right? And so for me, in a nutshell, that is the kind of rapid change that we're experiencing, that the story that we tell ourselves of the way we are and the institutions that reflect that haven't really caught up to that at all. I mean, I was really struck by this, and she may have thought it was throwaway from last year's talk that Elizabeth gave here. I wasn't here, but I watched the YouTube of it. And she said, we are either limited by or liberated by our worldview. And so one of the things that I really am encouraging people in the process of talking about monetary reform and economic reform is to be liberated by what is possible and not limited by what is possible. There's so much in the movements that, you know, look at the world that is as a zero-sum game, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's shifting so quickly. To talk even about monetary reform as creating jobs in some ways is like superfluous. I mean, to me, it's almost irrelevant. I mean, if we really look at the way the economy is going, we are living in a less work-oriented society, culture. It's happening. Walter talked about that the other day in terms of automation. It's not that the jobs went overseas. I mean, many did. They've been replaced. We've had a trade policy, but we haven't had an automation policy, as one writer talked about it. And my favorite example of that is, I think it's Norelco or Philips, the Dutch electronics worker. They had a plant that made men's razors in Holland for a long time. In the late 70s, they shut it down. They built one in China. Started manufacturing there. In 2004, 2005, they came back to Holland, built another razor factory there. It employs about 10 people. The guys that run the computers, the machines, and the checkers, the inspectors, the package inspectors. It's called the dark factory, some places, because they can run 24 hours, there's no breaks, they don't need heating, air conditioning, lighting. Some of the German auto manufacturers are coming very, very close to that. And even the steel manufacturers in the United States. I mean, in Indiana, there's still a friend of mine visited a track rolling plant where they make, very long tracks for metros and for railroads. And it's been in operation, but it's been completely modernized. Where there was once 2,000 people working there, there are now about 200, and 50 of them are, running computers. And that's it. And so I think that what I like to talk about is that what's really happened in the last 100 years is that the delivery of all of the necessities of human life have been monetized. And that's why monetary reform is so important, that we've monetized all the necessities of life. They were never all monetized. Most people grew at least half their food in the United States for a very, very long time. And they canned it and they stored it. We didn't have this massive trade thing. And the other is, I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but these are like really things that I've been working with that have come up as a result of all the years that I spent working in banking. We talked about yesterday, somebody raised the whole issue of the various panics and everything. I mean, in the banking world, there was something every year from like 1970 on, just about. I mean, you had and the banking committee in the House had jurisdiction over all the bailouts. You had in 68, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad merged, and that almost immediately crashed. And so there was that. There was, the Franklin National Bank. You had the Boeing bailout in 1971 when Rolls-Royce went bankrupt, and they were the main engine supplier for Boeing. You had the Franklin National Bank, which was like the 20th largest bank in New York, which essentially crashed the international funds flow for a while because they were a major exchange agent. Dreyfus in '82, the government securities dealer, United Baldwin, which was the major life insurer and held the annuities for so many people that completely disrupted, the insurance business. So there's, I'm not even looking at, like Penn Square and some of the ones that came out of the savings and loan, that the corrections that we thought we made, okay. So one of the, there's this guy, Terence McKenna. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He's kind of a kooky guy. He's an ethnobotanist, better known for his support for the use of entheogens to like wake people up. But he had a phrase that it just resonates with me, that our culture is our operating system. And we see everything through the lens of what this operating system presents us. So if we're working from logical positivism, we're not going to see the bugs that, you know, if we're operating from capitalism 5.0, we're not going to see the faults that, you know, create the pollution and the threats to the environment. I mean, I haven't even gotten to the environment stuff, because I think I see them all as related. I see them all as related, and that we've moved. If we have our operating system conceives of the sort of natural right or inevitability to have private ownership of natural resources, for example. Now, where did that idea come from? I mean, the Scottish philosophers toyed with the idea that it didn't make any sense at all. It grew kind of into being after, as a way of allowing the breakup of the feudal order. I mean, I see everything as an evolution, really, that capitalism today is an evolution from the chaos of the late after the Civil War. The financial panic every year. There were major ones that completely upended businesses and allowed huge mergers. That corporate response was first pooling, and they built then of competition and setting artificial prices that ultimately even a Republican Senate that was controlled by state legislators who at that time selected the U.S. senators enacted the Antitrust Act. I mean, it was such a serious problem. And that's also a good example of problems that rise up that have to get addressed legislatively, that address the powers. I mean, the powers that be then did not want that. And now we have a situation where it's still on the books, and as Greg talked about, you know, just non-attention to it. They allow the mergers and the acquisitions to go through, so that we have wound up in a situation where there are 4 or 3 major telecommunications carriers, 6 corporations control all the media and restrict what we do. That there was there's also the issue for me of what kind of life do we want and how much do we honor life that is, all life that is, which would mean the earth. I'm addressing now groups that are concerned about the rights of the natural world. There's a lot going on out there. Rights of nature and Mother Earth, sowing seeds of resistance, love, and change. There's a lot of connection that we can make with those groups as well. If we look at we could look at the grant of ownership of natural resources to private entities as ultra vires. I mean, where does the authority come from to grant title to the earth by a government to an artificial entity? And you could argue that that's not there. I mean, it's kind of like, it's just like reframing. And if we didn't have to pay that much, the whole work structure, the whole needing for money to live is based on an ownership policy that in some ways no longer makes any sense. I mean, I understand what Nick was saying yesterday about the efficiency, but do we really want to live in a world where our food is grown by corporations that farm 10,000 acres? I don't. I want to know where it comes from, what they did to it. I like to go to my local farmer's market. I belong to 2 CSAs, one a spring and fall one and one a summer one, to get our food. And it just makes so much, I feel so much better knowing that what I'm putting in my body has been cared for. When it comes to the actual financial world, one of the things that I'm really intrigued by, and maybe I should have talked to some of you about this before I stood up here, but if what we're saying is that the money created by the bank at the point where the customer signs the note goes into the assets of the bank, and then the all basically against that asset. And you can draw it all at once and buy a house, or you can spend it out over time as like an annuity or whatever. But at that point, that's not a loan if the person who made the note created the money. Seems to me like the person who signed the note created the value because they made a promise that has an economic value. We promise to pay you back over time. If that's the case, then, and the bank has not actually put any money out, why are they collecting interest? Interest is for the forbearance of the use of money that you otherwise would have. And if they haven't forborne the use of any money, then we shouldn't pay any interest. So the payment, we can do 5-year mortgages or 10-year mortgages, and if you are current on your payment, I mean, there has to be some bookkeeping fees, obviously, but not interest. And then your payments would actually be current to principal, and so the risk of foreclosure would be like minimized to a very large extent. So, and again, this is just a way of reframing the issue. Nothing has really changed. We're looking at a change in the reframing, just the way that the courts sort of surreptitiously over time changed the nature of a corporation, case by case over 30 years. Corporations had been thought about as inventions. The inventions of the state regulated, and there was all kinds of social responsibility. In the late 19th century, when they started shifting it to say that they started giving them personhood, often without much legal argument about it. And so that a lot of the things that we're dealing with now were just changes in perspective that slipped in. And there's, again, it's our operating system that's it. It's the way we look at things. I'll just conclude with a quick quote. And there it is. This was from Derek Jensen, who wrote a beautiful book on language. It's a dark book, but it's a book about, it's called A Language Older Than Words. And he's like, perception is, of course, tied to preconception. I have, as is true for each of us, a pair of cultural eyeglasses that will determine to a greater or lesser degree what will be in focus, what will be a blur, what gives me a headache, and what I cannot see. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for those insights. And there's a few questions. We've just got time while Professor Huber gets set up here. So Steve Walsh has got the mic, so if there's any questions, by the way, for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I have a question, Jim. I know that you do legal work, and so you might be the best person to ask this question of. The Supreme Court in this country has ruled on
who's asking
cases,
me? Oh yeah,
money over the past 200 years. We've had a number of big cases decided at the Supreme Court deciding money. Do you think that at any of these cases that you know of, did we make a wrong turn somewhere at that level? Did the Supreme Court at any time kind of take a wrong turn with regards to money in banking?
This is still on. Did it take a wrong turn? Well, I think as I said during the talk, it's all an evolution, and it's been an evolution of a conception of the way that the culture is. We can look back now and say that was the wrong turn, or that was a turn that didn't really evolve for the best for all. I don't really like. There's a part of me that really doesn't want to have judgments about that, because I think it's all an evolutionary flow that we can affect, and that we have to be clear about what's happening. I mean, the young people today are quite aware that the story they're being told as to what their life should be like isn't true. They're not going to have a career for 30 years. They're not going to have a retirement available at the end. They may have to forego owning a house altogether, because they're going to spend 20 years paying off their educational debt, which is essentially an abrogation of the state governments. I mean, when I was in school, the tuition was a lot less. So we had to pay tuition. It wasn't like California in the late 60s that said if you were, a resident of California and you graduated from California high school and you had, a certain grade point average, you went to any California university you could get into for free. And there was like this whole generation that, my generation, that got educated relatively cheaply, as the generation before me, the post-war generation. I mean, I was a baby boomer, so I was, they went through on the GI Bill to a large extent. So it's just the way that there's not one single case that I would say was like a change. I mean, Tom Hartman argues that that a big change came with the Supreme Court decision in 1876 on corporations, I think, and he argues that it was just the way the clerk wrote up the head note that the decision itself didn't actually hold that, but it's been cited as holding that ever since. And so, yeah, I mean, there's some lawyers out there that think that there were some changes that. But what would it have been if they hadn't gone that way? I don't know. I mean, we don't know what the other side is. Yes, Elizabeth? Oh, Nick,
this is maybe kind of a follow-up, but in the courts, we have the ruling on that Lewis versus the U.S. in '82 about the Supreme Court for tort purposes. But I don't believe the Supreme Court has ruled on the Federal Reserve System, but have there been attempts to make them rule on that? Or maybe they have ruled on it.
I'm not aware of any on that. No, I don't. I might have mentioned the last time I was here. I mean, the closest I got to that was a discussion in a full committee hearing one day between, I think it was John LaFalce, but it was before he was chairman of the committee, and the general counsel from the Fed. And they had like a 15, 20-minute discussion, which a few other people joined in on exactly what the Fed is. If it's a government agency, under what article would we say that it is? The Fed's been very ambiguous itself about what it is. We can get into that. That's another discussion. They keep a letter from FDR in a safe down there that they rely on for their exemption from the civil service system, except for those chapters of Title V that they choose to use. The health insurance part of it, they just use that, but they say we're not subject to the title itself. So, anybody? Okay, Elizabeth had a question. Just one more question.
I'll ask you with my question.
Please give another warm round of applause to Wert.